Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name is Renee McKenna. I'm a therapist and shamanic healer, and I'm here today with Akashic Bec, who is a certified Akashic record reader, a numerologist, and hypnotherapist. Welcome, Bec.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here today.
Really glad to have you here. So, talk to us about Akashic Records.
Yes, ma'am. Where to begin? So, for anyone who doesn't know what the Akashic Records are, it is basically a history of our souls, to put it very mildly, to put it in a compact frame. Everyone and everything ever in existence ever has an Akashic Record. We have Akashic Records. Our dog has an Akashic Records. The planet has an Akashic Record. And basically it's just basically the story of our souls. It tells about events great and small, and it just is a catalog of that journey. It contains so much information, like I don't think our human brains could even like wrap our minds around it. We
Mhm.
can find out, part of our purpose, like our purpose in our lifetimes. We can find out our connections to other people. It's basically like a metaphysical supercomputer of the universe's information.
Mhm.
And it's something that, um, fortunately, we can all access. But it's a lot of energy. It's very, to me, it's very sacred, and it takes a lot of reverence to access the records. So yeah, that's my definition in a nutshell.
So, how did you come to read Akashic Records into this work?
Well, I'll give you the condensed version. I I started going through my spiritual awakening in 2009, which it was completely unbeknownst to me that's what was happening. And during that time I started to have bits and pieces of my spiritual gifts. So primarily, which we all have spiritual gifts, and we have different levels of access to them, right? As we work on them. So I started working with my clairaudience. That's kind of what primarily came online for me first, and what I
Mhm.
started working with and developing first. And then I started to develop my claircognizance, which is like seeing things and clairvoyance and knowing things. And so I started to kind of work on building that. And in 2016, I kind of had this, what I call the floodgates opening.
Mm.
And I had all of these downloads, all of this information come online at that time. And that's when I was introduced to my guides. So I work with people's guides, in the records. We all have guides that, um, they're with us all the time. However, we do have specific guides that work with our Akashic records. And so that's when I was introduced to my guide of the Akashic records. His name is Mishka, and Mishka me to know that this was like part of my purpose and part of my journey in this lifetime was to learn the Akashic records and to read. And so he kind of, I mean, he literally led me every step of the way. He showed me the avenues I needed to go down in order to deepen into this work, to get more familiar with it, to understand it, and to also help others with it as well. So I then began, like I said, going down these avenues. I mean, they literally directed me everywhere I need to go. I had to have like complete trust and faith. And one day in, I believe it was 2017, I was led to this other Akashic Records reader who lives in Canada. Her name is Ashley Wood. And I really, really liked her podcast. That's kind of where I found her. And I started listening, and she was talking about, like, I'm here to kind of modernize the Akashic Records, which most people know Linda Howe. She's kind of like the OG. She introduced people to the Akashic Records, like the pathway prayer and things like that. And Ashley was coming in with kind of her own flavor of it. And I just really resonated with her. And so I took her course as well. I also took Linda's and I became certified, which you don't have to be certified to read the Akashic Records. And then from there, I just started practicing. I would go into my records regularly. Um, I had actually gone into my records prior to this and I did not know it. I was in this like really deep trance of meditation and I had gone into this area and they were like, it was just absolutely miraculous. I walked into what was a library. That's what it was manifested as. And I started seeing all of these books. It was just like this line, this like, or this trail that went down as far as the eye could see. And there were books aligned on each side. And I was given a book and I opened it. I did not realize at the time that was my book. Those were the Akashic Records, and I was being shown my book. So that's kind of how all of this began for me. And just from there, I just absolutely fell in love with reading the records, and I started studying it more and getting used to it because it takes a lot of energy to go into the records. Started kind of like navigating, like regulating my energy, um, understanding, what it felt like for me and how it looked for me to move through it. So I tell all the part about my spiritual gifts because that's how I'm able to interpret it. So I was like, okay, I was like being shown certain images, with claircognizant clairvoyance. I was being told messages through my clairaudience. And so I just kind of developed a harmonious relationship between my spiritual gifts and reading the records that allowed me to interpret it more clearly. So that's kind of been my journey, and as I've gone on, I started reading for other people later on. Once I was more comfortable with it, and it's just kind of evolved into where it is today.
Awesome. So when you read for people, is there anything similar about readings when you do them, or do people come with unique questions? How does that work?
Sure. So I read for my process anyway. I read for everybody the exact same way. Of course, the information's different. I start off with a very short guided meditation because it's very, very important for your energy to be grounded before you go into the records. So I ground our energy and I connect to my client's energy. And then I say the opening prayer that I personally like to use. And once I go into the records, I'm able to see, hear, feel, smell, whatever comes through. I share that information with my client. I typically enter into a scene, and then from there, my clients can ask their questions. I kind of signal them, like, hey, it's okay. You can go ahead and ask your first question.
Mhm.
And we go back and forth, and we just basically have a conversation. And I describe everything that is happening, everything that I see. And sometimes the messages are direct, like this is what's happening, this is the message. Sometimes they're kind of symbolic. And so I have to kind of interpret what I'm seeing. And oftentimes my clients do have questions and they can ask pretty much whatever they want. They just can't ask about other people's records.
Mhm.
And but they ask all kinds of things about their purpose, about their relationships, their connections, their career, their money, their health. They ask a plethora of things. There's really truly nothing off limits unless you just get a distinctive no. Like you don't need to know this at this time. Everything that comes through is information that is helpful and beneficial to the client. Now sometimes and I'm very big about, consent and like, people's comfort levels, because sometimes the information that comes through is not easy to share. And I always ask, are you comfortable with me sharing this with you? And they'll say yes or no. And so, I try to be just very mindful of what's coming through in times like that, because it can be a lot. It can be, because you're like not just looking at the beautiful, lovely aspects of it. There's some like really difficult aspects, like, you know, people passing away, trauma, catastrophic events and things like that. Particularly when we're talking about, people's past lives as well. They probably suffered things in those lifetimes as well, and they might be carrying an aspect of that still in their soul body, in their energy body.
And so from an Akashic perspective, I don't know if you see, well, do you see anything uh similar, or maybe even, let me ask this in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
How is trauma and difficulty held from an Akashic perspective?
So you mean like how do I see it, or how is it
Well, let me,
portrayed,
I'll
or
give you, I'll give you an example. So
okay.
I often, uh, at some point in my spiritual psychology work with clients, will introduce the idea that our human experience is a soul agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to be unattached to that because it's a particular perspective. Um,
Right.
and so, but it can be really helpful. I know it was helpful for me to actually take some responsibility for my life circumstances, not on a personality level so much. I've been through a lot of difficult things. That wasn't what I would have chosen. But if I think about it from a lifetime or a multi-lifetime, particularly, that each lifetime isn't in some ways that big of a deal. Like dying is not that big of a deal. It happens, it's part of a continuation. And
Mm-hmm.
so in that perhaps I chose or agreed to the circumstances of my life as an opportunity to grow, or an opportunity to be of service, or an opportunity to work through some karmic issue in this really definitive way that happens when we're a human and we actually experience it.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be really, again, empowering for people to think
Right.
about something that they've felt victimized by, and to
Mm-hmm.
flip it and ask the question, what would my soul be trying to learn here if I chose this circumstance or
Right.
experience, right? And then for me, from that perspective, everything that happens can have a nugget, a jewel, a lesson, a learning, a transformative wisdom aspect to it, rather than just being a horrible thing that I have to suffer through.
Mm-hmm.
So once again, I try to be unattached to people holding that view, because I don't actually know how the universe works, but I have found that helpful for myself to
Mm-hmm.
ask that question multiple times. And it's brought me into a willingness to change and grow and transform, rather than, again, to feel victimized by something, or doomed to repeat it, like I felt
Right.
with some of my relationship issues and addiction issues and other things that were like repetitive. It was like, oh, wait a minute, if I'm trying to learn something here,
Right.
that's a different then. So anyway, so I'm just curious from an Akashic perspective, um, how you see, or is there any similarity, or does each person approach them from their own perspective in a different way?
They definitely approach it from their own perspective, like you said. And yes, we do sign up for certain things. Sometimes there is, of course, there's always this aspect of free will, right? Where
Mhm.
we make choices, and our life turns out according to the choices that we make.
Mhm.
Um, and then we it gets complicated when you start bringing in other people, right?
Mhm.
So I would say that yes, like we definitely, from an Akashic perspective, we do agree. I mean, we agree on everything prior to our incarnation. So we do agree to come in with a certain set of circumstances. And I think there are some people who don't like to hear that. They're like, well, why would I choose that for myself? Why would this person choose it for themselves. And sometimes it's for our own benefit, and other times it can actually be for another person's benefit. We may have made a soul contract to choose to play that role in that person's life in order to help them grow. I have a very I can't share too much about it, but I did have permission to share this. I do have a client from a long time ago whose parent was very cruel, very abusive towards them, and that parent had passed away. And they asked me, what was the purpose? Why did I choose that parent to be my parent? Because children always choose their parent, but that's like a whole nother
Mhm.
story. And their parent agreed to, and it was very difficult actually to share this because they really did not want to receive the message at first. They were like, their parent chose to be that kind of parent in order to help this person, like push them forward and help them grow, and to truly understand compassion and how to heal trauma. And that's actually something that this person does in their life, is they help other people heal their traumas.
Mhm. Mhm.
And they would not have chosen that life for themselves, that path for themselves, had their parent not been that kind of, I guess, driving force, so to speak, going forward.
Of course.
um
Right.
mhm.
I mean, that's,
But from
I
a
mean,
yeah, sorry.
no, no, go ahead.
um Soul perspective, I saw, so when I connected to the energy of this person's parent, I just felt this immense love. I was like, your parent must truly have been, I mean, they must love you dearly. And they were like, no, actually, my parent was the worst, you know? And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, wow. And so, in going through that, I understood, and I was like, that really boggled my mind, to actually see it played out that way, as like a catalyst for growth.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I've kind of come to see all experiences that way. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, you would need to get permission to read for the parent, I'm sure. But
Hmm.
everything works together for the greater good, just like we breathe out carbon dioxide and trees take it in to make oxygen. So there's always, so even if
Hmm.
we are playing a role in us in another person's life, there's a way that that is part of our own soul journey as well. It all works in my humble and
Right.
inexperienced experience. It seems like it all works together. And I know
Hmm.
for myself, in looking at my incredibly difficult relationship with both of my parents, um, that there was, and I can see this now, like tremendous learn. I wouldn't be doing the work and I wouldn't be a therapist if it wasn't for my
Right.
parents, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, in all of the different circumstances I have. So I think that's the wisdom teaching, is to go beyond our attachment to our human suffering or experience and look as to how we're participating in a larger way with the larger system.
Right. And it doesn't make their cruelty or whatever the case may be, it doesn't make those things okay, right? But it can also teach us about, forgiveness, and, taking our pain and cultivating it and making it the driving force for our purpose.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. And how did we volunteer to have that particular, if we volunteered? I mean, there's a whole uh from the about karma. So
Right.
um does the idea of karma or cause and effect or past events that cause, future circumstances, does that play into the Akashic system?
Absolute. Yes, absolutely. Um, and some people, they don't like to use the word karma, but um for all intents purposes, yes. Karmic things definitely come and play. I mean, for the example I just shared, that was actually a karmic situation. It was something that had happened in another life, in a different scenario. but it had the same flavor, if you will. It had the same kind of similar circumstance, but it was playing out in this lifetime the way that it did. And so it was like definitely something karmic that needed to be moved through as well. So their connection was karmic. I find the connections between people to be the most karmic aspect.
It's interesting. It reminds me of a longtime client that I had who had tremendous physical suffering in this life.
Mm, mm,
Tremendous suffering, actually, debilitating.
mm-hmm,
And um, he was a deep practitioner, and actually, through past life work, I didn't interpret this for him, but this was his interpretation,
mm-hmm,
was that in past life, he was actually a very cruel high priest who used to rape and sacrifice people, particularly young women, in an ancient ritual and tradition.
mm-hmm,
And he was a very ambitious person. This was his in that past life. And
mm-hmm.
in this life, he's a very calm and kind and vegan, doesn't kill anything, very sensitive person. And he has really felt like his physical suffering was actually like his agreement at repentance. And I mean, I have to say, my own feeling is I don't think that the universe extracts repentance from us in that way, but he is such a sensitive person and felt so much guilt whenever we would come on these past life experiences where he was harming someone. He would feel horrible about it. And it was actually a way, in his understanding, to repent for his own guilt, to kind of even the score.
Mm-hmm.
My experience of the life force isn't that it extracts those from us, but I think for some of us, wherever we're at, we may actually want that on our own soul level. That was just an
Right.
interesting, it's much more complicated than I can understand, but
Right. Well, and I think too that's where free will comes in, right? Because you can choose to have that experience. You can choose to go a different path, and you can choose, like you said, the repentance aspect of it, like maybe forgiving the self, maybe but either way it's definitely a choice, and there's no like anything pressed upon us necessarily to force us to feel the way that we do. It's all about the type of experience we want to have, and how we want to choose to evolve and grow.
I've been a student in the last few years of David R. Hawkins and Fred Dodson. Both talk about levels of consciousness. You can look
Mm-hmm.
those people up if you're
Yes.
listening. And levels of consciousness being that our felt everything has an energetic resonance,
Yeah.
some of it from very low to very high. And both Fred Dodson and David Hawkins have developed scales. They're very similar of these resonances. They put numbers with them, mostly from 0 to 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And the higher resonances are the more positive aspects like love and acceptance, peace and bliss. And the lower ones are like guilt and shame and rage and judgment and fear. And so, depending on people's resonance or where they're at in their soul development, the idea being that ultimately we're all kind of going up the scale back into unification with oneness. But one of the things, particularly Fred Dodson teaches, and the law of manifestation, a lot of the law of attraction stuff, we'll talk about this, is that we can kind of choose and most of us don't realize that or want to take that level of responsibility or even know we can. But if this is like a movie that we're in, do we want to go to a horror movie, or do we want to go to a romance, or do we want to go to a comedy, or do we want to go to a meditation, video? Like, we can choose. And even I know for myself, I started off kind of in a horror movie, and now, I'm in the meditation video. So, and the humor. And I have lots of different ones anyway, but I don't go to the scary movies anymore. So, from an Akashic perspective, how is that kind of choice or awakening held? Is that predetermined? Or how does free will work in as you observe in the Akashic records?
Um, so it truly feels like just an open space. Like
Mm,
I think of it as like just a big open field and you can just run any direction that you want to, right? It's actually very freeing and liberating, which I find if I think about it for a minute, it's actually a little humorous because people come into the Akasha wanting to know answers, right? They come in with their questions. They want their questions answered. And a lot of times the answer's not definitive, right?
mm,
Because I
mhm,
tell them all the time, it's based on free will and the future's being created in every moment, right? And from from a like a future oriented perspective, for example, it's I see it as timelines. So these are like I guess you could call them options, right?
mm, mhm,
And I just see them and they're kind of tiered. They're almost like stacked on top of each other, and I see them as opportunities.
mhm,
And that's I mean I guess that would be another word for it. These are opportunities that you have. These are outcomes, potential outcomes, right?
mhm,
So and there's like okay, but I want to make sure that I make the right decision, you know, so
mm,
I can get on my highest timeline. And it's like, I can't tell you what to do. That negates free will. I cannot tell you, okay, step one, do this. You know, step two, do that. Now, I can give them a little sense of direction. It's like, well, you know, should you choose this, it'll probably be more in this area, right? So there'll be like optional timelines there. But as far as free will, it is truly it's an open energy, but it's also kind of like the force that holds us together at the same
mhm,
time. Um, it's kind of a complicated answer, I think. Um, but it's also like it is truly our choice, and we can choose whichever path like most resonates with us.
mhm,
And we get there by learning discernment and listening to ourselves and connecting with our inner selves is so important for us to understand the self, or at least try to. We can't probably can't understand all of it, but try to understand enough to know like where your consciousness is leading you.
mhm. Do you help people connect with their own guides and teachers?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And what method do you use for that?
So, whenever I'm doing a reading, so there's always a guide that comes in, and this guide is, and we have all different kinds of guides. We
Mhm,
have, of course, ancestors, which is probably, I would say, the most common one that comes forward because
mhm,
these are beings that have had earthly lifetimes. They
mhm,
have been human or this, that, and the other. And so they truly understand what it's like to have had an earthly existence. And
mhm,
so they're very helpful because they're like, yes, I know all about that 3D life and I can help you with your 3D things, right?
mhm,
Um, we also have higher dimensional beings. These higher dimensional beings are um, that most likely have not had an earthly lifetime. And so they have this like really unique type signature of energy. And they truly come, I find they come more often with people who are really, really focused on their purpose and their missions.
mm,
We also have animal spirit guides. So that's actually one of the other avenues of offerings that I have. So I work with people's animal spirit totems,
mhm,
and these represent like our gifts, our talents, our instincts,
mhm,
and our physicality. So sometimes we have animal spirit guides that come in who want to work with us. And then we also have um, every once in a while we have, you know, a family member who has actually passed in this lifetime. who, maybe transitioned at some point in this particular incarnation for that person. So they'll actually sometimes come through as well, and they'll want to give their own level of guidance. Sometimes it's very minimal, just because they're trying to, like, deal with their scope of their own
Right.
situation, their own passing and things like that. So, all that being said, just kind of give you a little idea of what's available throughout the records. So we can connect. And their guardian angels. We can connect. I can connect with them, and I'm basically the middleman. I am conveying the messages to my clients as they're being shared. Um, and sometimes I'm the interpreter on both ends. So if there's something that they don't understand, I can kind of interpret, and if there's something that my clients don't understand, I can kind of um, explain it to them in a way that they'll understand.
Mhm.
Um, because it may not even make sense to me, and I'll just be like, well, I'm going to share this anyway. Maybe it means something to you. So yeah, and then I connect them with their guides, and then typically towards the end, and a lot of times people ask this, they'll say, how can I connect with my guides? I will actually give them instruction. So sometimes the guides will tell me how they can connect with them
Mhm.
more, or how they have connected with them. And sometimes I just give them how I connect with my guides. Like, I just give them, like, different ways that they can facilitate. I mean, it's truly a relationship. It's a relationship that wants to be fostered. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate it a little bit, because it just seems so outside of our realm of understanding. But it's actually most of the time very simple.
Yeah.
And it's just about, like, you know, almost like a little reverence, like, really thanking our guides. I mean, they're truly, truly our allies, and they help guide us right through this world.
That's the basis of my work. It's the foundation is to connect people with higher consciousness, their own higher self, or guides and teachers, ancestors, angels, however they understand it, aspects of
Right.
divinity. Right. And I mean, it's always very affirmative to me that these, I like to call them technologies, actually spiritual technologies, of being able to connect with nature, elements of nature, ancestors, angels, animal spirit guides in animal form, and spirit guides in some kind of a human form. I mean, and then of course there's other ones as well, but
Right.
that these are all, I think they are, rather than a paradigm that somebody created that we fit into, I think that they are aspects of non-ordinary or metaphysical reality that we discover. And I mean, that's the
Mm-hmm.
thing I see, is that people just discover that these things show up. I
Mm-hmm.
certainly use the shamanic journey and guided visualizations or light hypnotherapy, which are all very similar, to be able
Mm-hmm.
to access, because we just have to quiet our rational mind, which is very limited with the physical world, and then just open
Mm-hmm.
up. And from almost everybody, except for a small percentage of people, and that's where psychedelics can come in, who have trouble being able to just access that realm that's really there for all of us, that we really are
Absolutely.
connected. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yes, and it's such a blessing, and it's truly kind of like where we end and where we begin at the same time.
Mhm. Mhm. So, how is Akashic work most helpful in your experience?
Um, and I think this is just I don't think this is a general answer. I think this is kind of specific for me, because I think, people can use the Akashic Records for a multitude of ways, right?
Mhm.
But for me personally, I use it to help empower my clients, to give them as much information as possible about themselves, because knowledge is power, right?
Mhm.
And, learning to understand the self, I feel like, is the key to, our part of our spiritual evolution. I feel like we can start to deepen and develop our intuition,
Mhm.
our spiritual gifts, and we can start to then utilize them in our human existence and just kind of elevate our lives, right? And and kind of backtracking to your last question, I really, really love connecting people with their guides. Um, it's almost like a family reunion, it's
Mhm.
like it's super rewarding. I also like to just inform people. Like I'm a 5-1 manifesting generator, if that means anything to human
Mhm.
design buffs out there. So I'm literally meant to give people information and do the research. And so I just utilize my gifts to give people information that they need that can help them, even if it's, on a short-term basis, even if it's something that's like currently going on in their life, that can help them move through it, and like I said, get on that highest timeline as humanly possible.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Anything people at home could do, or how do they get in touch with you? What can we leave people with?
Sure. Well, you can visit my website. It's www.akashicbec.com. I'm also on Instagram. I don't do a whole lot of social media,
Mhm.
but it's Akashic_Bec.
Mhm.
And you can follow me there. You can send me a DM if you like. And I also do readings. I live in the Memphis, Tennessee area. So if anybody's local, I do readings at a couple of different venues around Memphis.
Nice. And do you
Mhm.
do readings virtually as well?
Yes, absolutely. That's probably the majority of what I do. I read for people all over the planet.
Beautiful. Beck, thank you so much for sharing your gifts and your wisdom with us today. And we'll leave all of your links and information down below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And I'm wishing you well and blessings on your work.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you inviting me on here today. This was great.
It was a pleasure.